I still remember the sound of the plate hitting the table, louder than it needed to be, as if that noise was part of the humiliation. The food was cold, pieces mixed without care, leftovers that no one wanted. When I looked up, I saw her crooked smile, full of contempt, and heard the phrase that changed everything. "Eat the leftovers, old woman. You don't contribute anything here." My son was next to him, silent, looking at his own plate as if it wasn't me. It was there, on that table, that something inside me broke, and something much more dangerous began to form. Up until that point, I had been convincing myself that this was just a bad phase. I told myself that I needed to be patient, that I was living in their house out of necessity, that I couldn't create conflicts. But in that second, I realized that it wasn't about adaptation or coexistence. It was about power. She spoke to me as if she were talking to someone disposable, as if I were an old object forgotten in the corner of the house. And the worst thing was not the phrase. It was the silence of my own son, heavy as a sentence. I swallowed hard. I didn't answer. I picked up the fork with a trembling hand and felt the bitter taste rise before the food even touched my mouth. It wasn't hunger. It was shame. It was unbelief. I, who had spent my entire life supporting that family, was now being reduced to someone who had to be thankful for leftovers. As I chewed, I noticed that she was watching me, satisfied. That was not an impulse. It was calculated. She wanted to break me there, in front of him. The house was too quiet after that. No apology, no attempt to soften, just the sound of the television on and the smell of cold food in the air. I went back to the small room they gave me when they decided that I needed help. I sat on the bed and stared at my hands, marked by time, by the decisions I made, by the sacrifices I made. For the first time, I wondered how I got to that point without realizing that I was being pushed out of my own life. That night, I didn't sleep. Every word of her echoed in my head like an afterthought. "You don't contribute anything here." That wasn't just an offense. It was a declaration of silent war. She believed, with all conviction, that I was no longer worthless, that I was a burden, a body occupying space until the day it was convenient to discard me for good. And the scariest thing was to realize that she spoke with the security of someone who thinks she has already won. What she didn't know, what no one in that house seemed to remember, was that it all existed because of me. Every wall, every piece of furniture, every penny that supported that comfortable life was born from decisions I made when I was still invisible to their eyes. But there, at that table, I realized that my biggest mistake wasn't trusting too much. It was allowing them to believe that I no longer had a choice. And when someone believes you have no choice, they start treating you as a thing. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my chest and painful clarity. Something had changed. I was still afraid, yes, but it was accompanied by something else. Lucidity. I began to notice details that I had previously ignored. Her tone of voice when talking to me, quick glances at documents, the conversations interrupted when I entered the room. That wasn't just contempt. It was a hurry, like they were just waiting for the right moment to push me out for good. My son barely looked me in the eye. When he looked, he seemed loaded with guilt, but not enough to act. It was there that I understood something even more cruel. I was alone in that house. Not physically, but emotionally. And being alone among people who want something that is theirs is much more dangerous than being alone in the world. For the first time, I felt that my safety wasn't just emotional. It was concrete, real, threatened. I spent the whole day remembering decisions I made in the past, choices I made precisely so as not to depend on anyone. I remembered the day I decided not to transfer anything officially. I remembered why. Of the betrayal that taught me that love is no guarantee of loyalty. That truth, buried for years, came back to the surface as a late but powerful warning. They believed that everything was already solved, and that's when I understood. Their arrogance was born of ignorance. I didn't cry. Not that day. Instead, I began to observe. I watched as she spoke to me when she thought I didn't understand. I watched as my son hid behind the silence. I observed how the house no longer belonged to me, even though it was still legally mine. That gave me a strange sense of control. They were overconfident, and overconfident people always make mistakes. That night, I looked at myself in the mirror longer than usual. I saw an aged woman, yes, but not weak. I saw someone who had survived loss, betrayal, and difficult choices. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel sorry for myself. I felt angry, a silent, cold, organized anger. It wasn't the urge to scream. It was the will to act, to let them continue to believe the lie they created. That's how I decided. I wasn't going to react yet. I wouldn't confront it. I wouldn't ask for respect. I would wait. Every humiliation would be noted, every veiled threat recorded. They thought I was broke. They thought I wasn't in charge of anything anymore. Little did they know that at that very moment, while they called me a useless old woman, I was just beginning to remember who I really was. The fact that you are here, listening to this story so far, already says a lot about the sensitivity and attention you carry. What comes next isn't just about a family or a humiliation. It's about limits, dignity, and the moment when we decide not to accept less than we deserve. If you believe that these stories need to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel, because this support is what keeps these truths alive. I woke up early, before everyone else, as I had been doing since I moved into that cramped room down the hall. The silence of the house at that time was almost deceptive, as if she still remembered what she once was. I walked slowly to the kitchen and ran my hand over the countertop I had chosen years ago. Every detail of that house had my signature, my effort, my decisions. Still, I moved there like an unwanted visitor. I prepared my coffee with excessive care, as if trying not to leave a trace. I didn't want to give her any reason to roll her eyes or make acidic comments first thing in the morning. The simple act of existing seemed to cause discomfort. As the water warmed up, I realized that objects had moved around. Photographs of me had disappeared from the shelves. Small things, almost invisible, but that screamed a clear message. I was being erased little by little. When they came downstairs, the house changed temperature. Not on the thermometer, but in the air. She entered first, safe, confident, walking as the absolute owner of everything. My son came behind with the same distant look, as if he were always late for somewhere where he didn't have to think. She didn't even greet me. He just opened the fridge, sighed loudly, and complained about the lack of something I didn't even know I should provide. I sat down at the table and remained silent, watching. She spoke as if I wasn't there. He gave orders, commented on expenses, complained about bills, all in a tone that made it clear that this house had a hierarchy, and I was on the last step. At no time did she ask for my opinion, and the most painful thing was realizing that my son seemed comfortable with it, as if that dynamic were natural. After breakfast, I tried to go up to the room, but she interrupted me in the hallway. He said, without raising his voice, that I needed to warn before using the washing machine, because water and electricity are not free. I nodded, feeling my face burn. I wanted to say that I always paid every bill in that house. I wanted to say so many things, but I swallowed it all as I had been doing. It was not yet time. I spent the rest of the morning in the room, sitting by the window, looking at the backyard that I had renovated years ago. Every tree there was planted by me, each flower chosen carefully. Now I observed everything from a distance, like someone who had lost the right to move freely through his own past. It was strange how the house had become smaller since I had ceased to be respected. In the afternoon, I heard voices in the room. They stopped whenever I approached. It wasn't paranoia, it was standard. When I entered, they pretended to talk about trivial things, but I noticed documents scattered on the table, roles that I did not recognize immediately. My heart raced. It wasn't just contempt. There was something being organized without me, something that directly concerned my life. I returned to the room with the clear feeling that this place was no longer safe, not the way it should be. The house where I raised my son, where I buried my husband, where I built everything I had, now felt like hostile territory. And this did not happen suddenly. It was a slow, silent process, made up of small invasions, small silences, small humiliations accepted. That night, as I lay down, I thought about how I got there. I thought about every concession I made believing that I was preserving the family. I thought about how I confused love with renunciation. And most importantly, I thought about how they seemed so sure that I had nothing left to lose. This certainty was what scared me the most. And at the same time, what was beginning to give me a strange advantage. I started to pay attention to everything. In the schedules, in the comments, in the looks exchanged between them. The more I watched, the more it became clear that there was a hurry. She wanted to solve something, finalize something. As if my presence there was just an uncomfortable step before something bigger. And it was at this point that I understood. I was not just being disrespected. I was being managed. The next morning, I found my son alone in the kitchen. I thought about talking. I thought about asking him if he realized what was happening. But as I looked at him, I saw a man who had already chosen the easiest path, that of omission. And I realized with calm pain that I couldn't count on him. If I wanted to protect myself, I would have to do it alone. It was there, in that simple instant, holding a cold cup of coffee, that I accepted a hard truth. That house was no longer a home. It was a quiet battlefield. And if I wanted to survive with dignity, I needed to stop acting like a guest and start thinking like someone who still had power, even if no one else believed it. I never saw myself as fragile. but I learned that fragility is often something that others project onto you when they no longer need your strength. In my late 60s, I started to be treated as someone who inspires pity, not respect. My body aged, yes, but my mind remained sharp. Still, to them, I was just an old woman taking up too much space. I remembered when everything started to change. It wasn't with a fight, nor with a clear decision. It was with subtle comments, suggestions disguised as care. Maybe you'd better not drive anymore. Let us solve it. You don't have to worry about these things. Gradually, they removed me from the decisions that had always been mine, as if they were doing me a favor. When my husband died, I thought the pain would be the worst I would ever face. I was wrong. Loneliness made room for something even more cruel, the convenience of others. My grief became a justification for others to take on roles that I never gave them. I went from being a pillar of the family to someone who needed to be managed, and I allowed it because I was tired of losing. My son changed with me without realizing it, or pretending not to. He started talking to me as if I were emotionally unstable, as if any disagreement of mine was the result of age. When I insisted on something, he sighed, like someone dealing with a stubborn child. That hurt more than any direct offense, because it came disguised as care. She, on the other hand, never pretended. From the beginning, I looked at myself as a problem to be solved. He never raised his voice at first. He just ignored me. And ignoring is a sophisticated form of violence. You begin to doubt your own existence, your own weight in that environment, until the day when indifference turns into open contempt. I started to hear phrases like, "At her age, it's normal to confuse things," and "Don't take it the wrong way, she doesn't understand anymore." Each of these words was a shovel of dirt thrown over who I was. And the most perverse thing was to realize that they were said in front of me as if I were already absent, as if my presence was only physical. There was a day when I tried to argue about a bill paid twice. She cut me off in the middle of the sentence and said that I was confusing everything, that it was better to rest. My son nodded. It was then that I realized they didn't want my opinion. They wanted my submission. They wanted me to doubt myself. I started talking less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I realized that my every word was used against me. Silence became a form of protection. They interpreted this as a sign of weakness, as if I was finally accepting my place. Little did they know that I was just observing, recalculating, rearranging everything inside. The curious thing is that the more I kept quiet, the more confident they became. The daughter-in-law started to make bigger decisions without consulting anyone. He talked about sales, changes, future plans as if everything was already solved. I listened from the hallway door, feeling a mixture of fear and clarity. They weren't just underestimating me, they were discarding me. At night, alone in my room, I revisited my entire life. The hard choices, the calculated risks, the moments when I had to be tough to protect what I built. That woman still existed. She was just hidden under layers of tiredness and disappointment. And the more I remembered that, the clearer one thing became. I wasn't weak. I was surrounded. Being underestimated is dangerous for those who underestimate because it creates a false sense of security. They believed that I had already given up, that I no longer understood what was happening, that I didn't have the strength to react. This belief began to give me something I hadn't had for months. Time. Time to think. Time to plan. Time to let them make mistakes. At that stage, I accepted the label they gave me, the confused old woman, the uncomfortable mother-in-law, the woman who no longer commands anything. I accepted externally. Inside, I started to prepare. Because when everyone believes that you pose no risk at all, that's exactly when you become most dangerous. She never needed to raise her voice to impose herself. The certainty he carried was enough. He walked around the house like someone who has inherited everything, as if each object was just a formality before officially changing owners. The way she opened drawers, rearranged closets, and decided the fate of things made it clear that, in her mind, that house hadn't been mine for a long time. I began to notice how she talked about the future, always excluding me from it. When we sell this, when we reform that, when everything is in our name, it was never if, always when. That was not optimism. It was conviction. She acted like someone who had already received a definitive promise, even though she had never heard it from me. At times, he even explained decisions to me as if doing a favor. He said it was better this way, that I didn't have to worry, that these things were too complicated for me now. The tone was too sweet not to be offensive. A false caution, used only to reassure that I was out of control of my own life. She spoke of money naturally, but never with me. Always for my son, always in a low tone, always interrupting when I approached. There was a strange rush to everything, as if I wanted to resolve my existence right there, as if I were an uncomfortable stage before the life she believed she deserved. My son went with the flow. He nodded, signed papers without reading them carefully, accepted decisions that were not his. Sometimes he would cast a quick glance in my direction, almost asking for permission, but he never said anything. His omission was the fuel of her courage. Without resistance, arrogance grows free. One afternoon, I heard my name being used as justification. "She won't mind," said the daughter-in-law. "She doesn't even understand these things anymore." That was not said to me, but about me, and it hurt in a different way, because it showed that, for them, I was no longer a subject. It was an argument. It was an obstacle to be overcome. The most impressive thing was how safe she felt. There was no fear in her gestures, no caution, no doubt. It was as if he was absolutely sure that I could not react. And people who feel untouchable often make their biggest mistakes in exactly this state. I began to notice small flaws, contradictions in stories, dates that didn't match, poorly explained plans. Her arrogance was not accompanied by care. She did not hide. On the contrary, she displayed her power with pride, as if she wanted to be seen in charge. That told me much more than she imagined. There was a day when she entered my room without knocking, holding some papers. He said they were simple things, just to make everyday life easier. He didn't explain it properly. He just pointed out where I should sign when the time came. He smiled, an overconfident smile. That was the first moment I felt really afraid. It was no longer just humiliation. It was movement. Something was being prepared. And I wasn't part of the plan. I was the problem that needed to be solved before completion. For the first time, I was sure that if I kept pretending I couldn't see, I could lose a lot more than respect. I remembered the past again, the exact reason why I never officially transferred anything, from the promise I made to myself after an old betrayal, never to give control to those who confuse love with interest. That woman I was came back to my mind entirely, lucid, cautious, suspicious when it needed to be. Her arrogant certainty began to become my ally. The more confident she became, the less careful she became. And the less careful, the more visible the game that was being set up became. I didn't need to rush anything. It was enough to let her continue to believe that she had already won. That night, lying in bed, I realized something essential. She didn't respect me because she believed I had no more power. And as long as she continued to believe this, she would continue to reveal her intentions without realizing it. For the first time since the humiliation at dinner, I felt something resembling control. Silent, invisible, but real. I used to recognize my son by the way he looked at me. When I was little, his eyes looked for me anywhere. It was enough for me to enter a room for him to feel safe. Now, those same eyes ran away from mine. Not out of hatred, but out of cowardice. And this difference made everything hurt even more. His silence was not neutral. It never is. It manifested itself in the small gestures. In the look I looked away when she humiliated me. In the body that remained motionless when I was disrespected. In the speed with which I changed the subject whenever something became uncomfortable. He didn't defend me, but he didn't attack me either. He just allowed it. I tried more than once to talk. Not to accuse, but to understand. I asked if everything was okay, if I was getting in the way, if he wanted me to look elsewhere. He always answered with vague sentences, full of apparent care. She said that I was exaggerating, that she didn't want to say that I needed to rest more. Each such response was a silent request for me to keep enduring. There was an afternoon when she made a cruel comment about my memory, laughing, as if it were a joke. I looked at my son expecting something, anything. A look, a word, a minimal gesture. He smiled embarrassedly and said, "You know what she's like." At that moment, I understood everything. He had chosen the easy way out, and I wasn't part of it. The most painful thing was realizing that he wasn't evil. He was weak, and weakness, when placed alongside cruelty, becomes an accomplice. He knew something was wrong. I saw it in the tense shoulders, in the way he avoided being alone with myself, but knowing was not enough to act. It never is. I started to observe how he behaved when I was not around. The tone changed. He laughed more. I agreed more. It was lighter. My presence seemed to remind him of something he would rather forget. Who he was, who I was, and everything he owed me. Guilt bothered him, so he preferred to pretend I was the problem. I began to understand that for him, I represented conflict, and it represented comfort. Defending myself would mean confrontation, wear and tear, perhaps even losses. Remaining silent meant keeping everything as it was, and he chose what cost him the least, even if the price was my dignity. At times I even wondered if I had failed as a mother. A man had been created who was unable to face his own fear. This doubt gnawed at me for days, until I realized that it was no longer about education or the past. It was about choices made in the present, And in that present, he chose to omit himself. His silence also gave her a false legitimacy. Each time he didn't react, she felt more authorized, more confident, more owner of everything. His omission not only hurt me, it strengthened those who attacked me, and that made it all the more dangerous. There was one night when I heard the two talking in the living room. She spoke in a low but firm tone. He agreed. My name came up in the middle of the conversation, followed by phrases like, "It's better to solve it soon," and "She won't resist." My heart raced. That was no longer interpretation. It was flat, and my own son was involved. It was there that something closed inside me, not with explosive anger, but with a sad calm. I couldn't count on him anymore. Not to protect me, not to listen to me, not to respect me. That realization was painful, but also liberating, because when you stop expecting help from those who won't help, you start acting differently. That night, I cried in silence. Not for me, but for the mother I was, for the family I thought I had built. I cried for the bond that could no longer be the same as before. And at the same time, I accepted a hard truth. If I wanted to survive with dignity, I would have to act without waiting for my son to be by my side. When I wiped my face and lay down, I felt something solidify inside me. It wasn't hate. It was a decision. They had their plans. I would have mine. And from that moment on, there would be no more room for naivety. My son's silence had taught me in the cruelest way possible that no one would save me, so I would do it myself. There are truths that we bury not out of shame, but for survival. I buried mine many years ago when I learned the hard way possible, that blindly trusting can cost everything. At that time, I still believed that love and loyalty went hand in hand. All it took was a well-planned betrayal to destroy this illusion forever. It was after my husband's death that I made the decision that now changed everything. While everyone believed I was too weak to think clearly, I did just the opposite. I reviewed documents, contracts, wills. I analyzed every detail calmly. I knew that if I officially surrendered everything, I would lose the only shield I still had: control. At the time, no one questioned it. My son trusted me. The family believed that everything was just a matter of time. I let them believe that. I never said I had transferred anything, but I also never corrected it when they assumed I had. Silence, once again, was my protection. And now, ironically, it was the reason for their arrogance. The secrecy was not only legal, it was emotional. I never told anyone the real reason why I decided to keep everything under my name. I never spoke of the attempted manipulation I suffered years ago, when someone tried to rush me, pressure me, convince me that I should trust. That taught me that those who are in a hurry for their assets are not thinking about you. Over the years, I've kept everything organized, updated, legally sound, not out of constant distrust, but out of prudence. I knew that one day I might need to prove that I was still in control of my own life. I just didn't imagine that this day would come inside my own home, at the hands of my own family. While they talked about inheritance as something, no subscription, no transfer, no concessions, everything continued exactly where it had always been, under my responsibility. This truth brought me a strange sense of relief and sadness at the same time. Relief to know that I still had real power, sadness for realizing that he would be needed. I never wanted to use it as a weapon against those I loved. But there, at that moment, it became clear that love was no longer a factor in that equation. They were playing another game, and I needed to accept that. I started to look at my daughter-in-law with different eyes. Every gesture of hers made more sense now. The hurry, exaggerated confidence, the way he talked about things that didn't belong to him. She wasn't just cruel, it was strategic, but based on false information. And nothing is more dangerous than someone who acts with conviction on a lie. My son, in turn, seemed to believe that everything was already resolved, that the future was assured. Maybe someone told him that. Maybe he just took over. Either way, the truth was simple. They were building plans on something that was never delivered. And the further they advanced, the deeper they dug their own mistake. That night, I opened an old box in the back of the closet. Inside were copies of documents, letters, records, everything organized, as I always did. I ran my fingers through the papers calmly, feeling a mixture of pride and melancholy. That was not just heritage. It was my story, my choices, my autonomy. For the first time since it all began, I felt something resembling security. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I was not defenseless as they believed. The secret I'd kept for so long was now the centerpiece of it all, and I needed to decide when and how to use it. I closed the box and put it back in place. It was not yet time. They were still overconfident, carelessly, showing the intentions without filter. And I needed more than reason. It needed proof, context, allies. The secret was powerful, but it would only work if revealed at the right time. Lying in bed, looking at the ceiling, I thought about how my life had taken that turn. I never imagined that I would need to defend myself from my own family, but here I was, more lucid than ever. They thought I was just a humiliated old woman. Little did they know that I was guarding the only truth capable of overthrowing everything they believed they controlled. Until then, everything had been done carefully enough that I could pretend it was just disrespect. Comments, silences, small invasions. But that day, the line was crossed. The threat ceased to be emotional and began to have form, plan, and urgency. And I felt it in my body before I even understood it clearly. She called me to sit in the living room in the middle of the afternoon. The tone was too calm, almost gentle. My son was next to him, serious, with his hands clasped together, avoiding staring at me. On the table, a thin paste. That detail was enough to speed up my heart. Folders don't appear out of nowhere. Ministries announce decisions. She started talking about organization, making things easier, how everything would be simpler if I collaborated. He used soft words, but his gaze was firm, impatient. He said that I had been forgotten, that I needed professional help, that they were worried about my safety, security. The word sounded like irony. When he opened the briefcase and slid some papers towards me, I felt a chill rise down my spine. He did not explain everything. He didn't have to. He only said that they were authorizations, normal things in case of an emergency. He spoke of doctors, of future decisions, of avoiding problems. But there was something there that didn't belong in that innocent conversation she was trying to enact. I asked what would happen if I didn't sign. She did not respond immediately. He looked at my son. He swallowed. She was the one who spoke. I said that maybe it would be better for me to consider a specialized place, where they would really take care of me. An asylum. The word was not spoken with cruelty, but with coldness, as a logical solution to an inconvenient problem. My whole body reacted. It wasn't just fear. It was the clear feeling of being pushed out of her own life. I realized at that moment that they were no longer waiting. They were acting. And that my stay in that house was already being treated as something temporary. I looked at my son, waiting for some sign of retreat. It didn't come. He just said it was for my good, for my sake. That phrase, said so many times throughout history to justify abuse, fell on me like an unbearable weight. They were ready to decide my fate without me. I refused to sign. He said he needed to think. She took a deep breath, visibly angry, but disguised it. He said that I was being difficult, that I didn't need to complicate it. But the controller had already slipped a little from her hands. For the first time, I saw real impatience, and that confirmed everything for me. After that conversation, the atmosphere of the house changed. There were no screams, but there was distance. Doors closed, interrupted conversations, calculated looks. The threat now hung in the air, concrete, silent. I knew they wouldn't give up easily. That was not a test. It was the beginning of something bigger. That night, I could barely eat. Every sound of the house made me alert. I thought about how easy it would be for them to push me away, to declare me incapable, to put me in a place where I would lose any voice. For the first time, I felt that my time was being counted. It was there that I understood that observing was no longer enough. Waiting passively could cost me everything. I needed to act, not impulsively, but precisely. The threat had become real, and I needed to get out of the target position before it was too late. I remembered the box in the closet, documents, of the control that was still with me. That was no longer just a future security. It has become a present urgency. If I didn't move now, they would move for me. The next morning, I woke up with a firm decision. I would not show fear. I wouldn't change my behavior. They would continue to believe that I was confused, hesitant, vulnerable. In the meantime, I would start preparing something much bigger than they imagined. Because when someone tries to steal your autonomy under the guise of care, you're not offering help. You're declaring war. And I was finally ready to respond. This part of the story is the hardest to share, because it's where I had to admit everything I missed trying to keep the peace. Telling this means reliving choices that cost me silence, dignity, and even bonds that I thought were unbreakable. If you've come this far, it's because you understand that some truths only survive when someone has the courage to say them out loud. So sign up, not as a support for me, but as a gesture so that voices like this are not erased when they get more uncomfortable. In those days, fear ceased to be abstract. It was no longer a fuzzy feeling, something I tried to push away. He woke up with me and lay down next to me. It was in the crossed looks, in the doors closed more forcefully than necessary, in the way my name started to be avoided in conversations. I began to imagine scenarios that I never thought I would live. A room that was too white, voices deciding for me, personal belongings boxed in by strangers. I thought about my grandson, about the real possibility of being taken away from him with the excuse that I was not well. That hurt more than any previous humiliation. It wasn't just about losing assets. It was about losing my identity. Every time I crossed paths with my daughter-in-law in the hallway, I felt like I was being evaluated, as if she measured my level of resistance. He spoke to me in a controlled way, but there was something new in his posture. Surveillance. She no longer had the patience to wait indefinitely, and that made everything more dangerous. My son started to avoid being alone with me. When I entered the room, he would find an excuse to leave. His withdrawal was no longer just emotional, it became strategic, as if any proximity could compromise something they were planning. This realization was like a slow but deep blow. I started locking the bedroom door at night. A simple gesture, almost automatic, but it said a lot about how much I no longer felt safe. I never imagined that I would need to protect myself like this inside my own home. That made me realize how much the situation had crossed any acceptable limit. There was a day when I heard my name followed by the word documents. I stopped in the hallway, my heart racing. I couldn't hear everything, but it was enough to understand that something was moving forward without me. Their haste grew in the same proportion as my margin of error decreased. It was in this state of constant alert that I realized something important. Fear, despite paralyzing, can also clear. I began to organize my thoughts more objectively. What could I lose? What was still under my control? Who could help me? For the first time, I began to think like someone who really needed to defend himself. I remembered the women of my generation, taught to swallow, to endure, not to create conflicts. That education brought me there, but it wouldn't get me out of there. I could no longer act as if everything was going to take care of itself. There was no more room for naive hope, just for strategy. The fear of losing everything began to turn into something different. It did not disappear, but gained direction. He pushed me into quiet action. I started to make mental lists, to remember names, dates, details that could make a difference. Each piece of information started to have weight. I also realized that they underestimated me too much to notice these changes. They interpreted my silence as giving up, my calm as confusion. This gave me an unexpected advantage. The less threatening I seemed, the freer they felt to show their intentions. At night, sitting in bed, I thought about everything I had built throughout my life. Not only heritage, but choices, autonomy, identity. I could not allow all this to be erased with a forcibly torn signature or with a convenient report. It was at this point that I accepted a difficult truth. If I wanted to maintain my dignity, I might have to give up the idea of family as I knew it. That hurt, but it also strengthened me, because nothing is more dangerous than trying to save relationships that have already decided to sacrifice you. When I closed my eyes that night, I didn't ask for everything to go back to the way it was before. I only asked for clarity and firmness to go through what lay ahead. They believed I was too scared to react. They were right about fear, wrong about the rest. I didn't expect help. At that point, she had already accepted that she would face everything alone. Maybe that's why it took me a while to realize that someone was watching me with different attention, without haste, without judgment. Someone who didn't see me as a problem to be solved. It appeared in a simple way. A short conversation in the backyard, while I tried to breathe away from the heavy atmosphere of the house. She said that she had seen me tense for days, that something didn't feel right. He didn't ask too much. He just made it clear that he was there if I needed to speak. That baffled me more than any direct confrontation. For a long time, I hesitated. Speaking up meant admitting that I was at risk, that he had lost control of his own house, that my family was not the refuge I had always defended. But there was something in her gaze, firm, attentive, that didn't bring pity. It brought respect. I started slowly. No details, no accusations. I spoke of discomfort, pressures, documents that I was asked to sign. She didn't interrupt me, he just listened. And when I finished, I said something that changed everything. This is not care, this is abuse. The word was suspended in the air. Abuse. I had never used that term to talk about my own life. It seemed exaggerated, dramatic. But when she explained it calmly, everything started to make sense. Isolation, constant invalidation, the hurry, control disguised as worry. She asked me if I had anyone I trusted outside that house. A lawyer, an accountant, anyone who knew my story. I immediately remembered someone from the past, someone who had helped me years before, when I was still making decisions without asking anyone's permission. Someone I hadn't looked for a long time precisely because I didn't want conflicts. That same day, with trembling hands, I made the call. The voice on the other end recognized mine right away. That gave me a strange feeling of returning to myself, as if I was awakening a dormant part of my identity. I explained little, but enough to hear the phrase I needed, "Don't sign anything." and come and see me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't imagining things, that my perception was not distorted by age or fear. There was, indeed, something wrong. And there were, yes, legal, clear, possible paths. That didn't solve everything, but it completely changed my position on the board. I started to act even more carefully. Not to hide, but not to arouse suspicion. I remained silent. I continued to look confused. They didn't notice anything. The daughter-in-law was safe, convinced that I was cornered. My son remained distant, comfortable in his own omission. At night, in the room, I mentally went over every conversation, every detail. For the first time, I didn't just feel afraid. I felt structure, direction. Someone saw what I was experiencing and didn't minimize it. This, in itself, was already a kind of rescue. I realized then how much loneliness had weakened me. Not for lack of strength, but for lack of mirror. When no one validates your reality, you begin to doubt it. Having someone say, "This is not normal," was like reclaiming the ground under your feet. It was not about revenge, at least not at that moment. It was about protection, to ensure that I wouldn't be pushed out of my own life without a fight. And for the first time, this struggle did not seem impossible. I lay down that night with a new sensation. It was not complete relief. It was something more sober, preparation. I was still at risk, but now I was no longer blind. The game had changed, and without them noticing, I no longer played alone. After that conversation, something in me reorganized. It was not a visible change, one of those that alter posture or tone of voice. It was internal, silent. I started to see every detail of the house as part of a board. Every word spoken, every gesture, every absence began to make sense within a larger logic. I continued to act as before. He walked slowly, forgot things on purpose, asked repeated questions. They saw it as confirmation of what they already believed, that I was confused, vulnerable, close to giving in. The daughter-in-law seemed relieved. My son, even more distant. None of them realized that this confusion was calculated. I started to record everything. Dates, exact phrases, strange requests, sudden changes in behavior. He kept it in his memory, and when he could, he wrote it down discreetly. Not out of paranoia, but out of clarity. I needed facts, not just feelings. He knew that sooner or later someone would demand proof. I organized my documents little by little, always when the house was empty. I opened old folders, checked signatures, dates, clauses. Each roll reinforced something essential. I hadn't lost control. I had only allowed them to believe that. That difference was everything. I arranged short meetings, always under simple pretexts. A trip to the pharmacy, a short walk, a medical appointment. In these intervals, I strengthened myself. I received guidance, understood scenarios, learned what I could and could not do. Information has become my shield. Fear still existed, but now it walked alongside strategy. I was no longer paralyzed. On the contrary, it kept me alert. I began to measure each reaction of the daughter-in-law. When she insisted too much, I backed off a little. When I relaxed, I moved forward internally. It was a game of patience. My son noticed something different, although he couldn't say what. He started to watch me more closely. He asked vague questions, tried to get closer at specific times. I answered neutrally. I couldn't trust him. Not yet. Maybe never again. There was a day when the daughter-in-law commented with a satisfied smile that everything was almost resolved. That sentence confirmed what I suspected. They believed they were in ultimate control of the situation, and when someone believes they are about to win, they let their guard down. I also began to prepare myself emotionally. He knew that when the truth came out, nothing would be simple. There would be no easy reconciliation. There would be no apologies capable of erasing what was done. I needed to be ready to lose certain illusions along with fear. I started to rehearse conversations in my head, not to discuss, but to affirm, to say what needed to be said without trembling, without asking permission. That gave me a strange feeling of strength. It wasn't anger. It was firmness. At night, before going to sleep, I repeated to myself, I know who I am. I know what I built. I know what is at stake. Those simple words have begun to replace the guilt that will accompany me for weeks. I was not responsible for their cruelty. I wasn't to blame for protecting me. The woman I was becoming was not bitter. She was lucid. Each day of silence now had a purpose. Each humiliation endured had a defined limit. I was no longer just resisting. I was getting ready to turn the tables. And while they continued to believe that I was getting weaker and weaker, I felt something grow calmly inside me. Something solid. Something that didn't need to be announced. Because when the time is right, power doesn't scream. He reveals himself. She started to walk around the house with a different smile. It wasn't joy. It was anticipation. like someone who already sees himself on the other side of the finish line. He spoke on the phone without hiding, mentioning plans, changes, reforms. He used the future as if it were already signed, stamped, guaranteed. I noticed that he stopped pressing me directly. That initial urgency gave way to a dangerous confidence. She believed that I had already given in from the inside, even without signing anything. I interpreted my silence as defeat, my calm as resignation. That's exactly what I needed her to believe. My son has also changed. It was lighter, looser. He made comments about travel, about when everything was resolved. I never included myself in those sentences. He spoke as if I were a bureaucratic detail about to be resolved. That hurt, but I no longer reacted. Pain now had a function. One morning, she casually commented that she had set aside some things from my room for donation. He said that I didn't use it anymore, that it was better to let go. He said this while folding a garment that I immediately recognized. My impulse was to snatch her from her hands, but I didn't. I just watched. Every abuse now became proof. She started to make mistakes. Small mistakes, but revealing. He confused dates. He mentioned values that didn't make sense. He spoke of decisions that could never be made without my signature. Arrogance was opening cracks, and I wrote everything down mentally, with cold precision. There was a dinner party where she made a comment about the asylum again, this time in a joking tone. He laughed, expecting complicity. My son laughed too, nervously. Not me. I just looked up and stared at her for a few seconds longer than comfortable. She looked away. It was the first time. That brief exchange showed me something important. Behind the trust, there was fear. A small fear, still controlled but present. She needed to believe that I was under control. Any sign to the contrary destabilized her. This gave me more clarity on when to act and when not to. I started to answer even less. The economy of words has become a strategy. The less I said, the more they revealed. The freer they felt, the more they talked too much. It was a predictable, almost mechanical movement. My ally warned me. The moment was approaching. It could not be too soon, nor too late. The exhibition needed to be complete, cool, public, irreversible. I needed to make sure that when the truth came out, there was no room for distortion. Meanwhile, she allowed herself to celebrate ahead of time. She commented with friends, made plans out loud, reorganized the house as if I was no longer part of it. That showed me the size of the fall that awaited her. The higher the jump, the harder the landing. At times, I confess, I felt sorry. Not for her, but for the illusion that was about to be shattered. Then he remembered the plate with leftovers, from asylum, of the pushed documents, and the feather dissolved. Not every fall is unfair. Some are consequences. That night, I reviewed everything one more time. Papers, records, notes. Everything was in place. I wasn't improvising. He was not acting on impulse. Every step had been thought out, and it brought me a serenity that they would never imagine possible in someone they considered weak. She believed she had won. The house, the money, the control. Everything seemed to be on track. And it was exactly at that moment, when her confidence reached its peak, that I knew the turnaround was ready. All you had to do was choose the day. I knew I couldn't make a mistake. A single misstep could confirm everything they said about me. Confusion, fragility, incapacity. Therefore, each movement started to be millimetrically calculated. No emotional confrontations, no hasty revelations. The plan needed to speak for itself. I began to review every detail with an almost obsessive attention. Dates, signatures, forgotten clauses, old records. Everything needed to be impeccable. Not only to protect myself, but so that there would be no doubt when the time came. The truth needed to be solid, cold, impossible to be distorted. I set up the decisive meeting with the help of my ally. It wouldn't be at home. It wouldn't be in particular. It needed to be a formal environment, with witnesses, where emotions did not cancel out facts. A place where I wasn't seen as a mother, mother-in-law, or elderly woman, but as someone with rights, voice, and legal authority. Meanwhile, at home, I continued to play the role that was expected of me. I forgot little things, asked repeated questions, accepted decisions, without arguing. They saw in this confirmation that I was increasingly dependent. The daughter-in-law relaxed for good. He started to talk openly about the after, without worrying if I heard. My son seemed relieved. Perhaps he believed that everything would be resolved without conflict, that I would be removed in an organized, clean, scandal-free way. That fantasy of harmony hurt me, but it also showed me how wrong he was about what was to come. There was an afternoon when the daughter-in-law tried again to get me to sign some papers. This time, with more insistence. I said I couldn't see well, that I needed new glasses. She sighed, impatient, but backed away. That small, quiet victory confirmed to me that I still controlled the pace. At night, alone, I felt the weight of everything that was about to happen. It wasn't just a legal confrontation. It was a definitive break. There would be no going back to what we were before. That awareness brought sadness, but no doubt. Some bridges burn not out of anger, but out of necessity. I prepared myself emotionally for the worst-case scenario, for accusations, for attempts to invert history, for strategic tears. I knew that the daughter-in-law would not accept losing without a fight, and I knew that my son might try to hide behind the confusion. I needed to be firm, Clara, irreducible. I repeated to myself that I wasn't doing it out of revenge. I was doing it to protect myself, to preserve my dignity, to make sure that no one else would decide my fate without consulting me. This difference was essential so as not to get lost in the process. The plan did not involve shouting. It involved revelation. It did not involve direct humiliation. It involved consequence. I didn't need to put them down. It was enough to expose what they had done. Truth, when presented in the right place, is enough. I started to sleep little, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. My mind worked all the time, reviewing lines, imagining reactions. Still, there was a strange calm accompanying me. I knew I had done everything in my power. On the scheduled morning, I woke up before the alarm clock. I looked at my reflection in the mirror for a few seconds longer. I saw there a tired woman, yes, but whole. There was no doubt in my eyes anymore, only decision. I took the folder with the documents and closed the zipper carefully. That simple sound marked something definitive inside me. The silent plan was complete. And from that moment on, there was no room for retreat. The truth was about to come out of the shadows. The environment was cold, too organized for emotions, and yet I felt the weight of what was about to happen the moment I sat down. The daughter-in-law entered confidently, speaking quietly to my son as if she already knows the outcome. They believed that this meeting was just another bureaucratic step. I knew it was the end of a carefully sustained lie. When they started talking, I realized how comfortable they were. She laid out plans, mentioned future decisions, spoke of my care as if I were not there. He used technical, rehearsed words, trying to appear responsible and rational. My son nodded, nervous but aligned. That only reinforced how much they underestimated me. I waited. I didn't interrupt. I let them talk more than they should. Each sentence was a confirmation of what they had tried to do behind my back. When I was finally given the floor, I felt the silence change shape. He was no longer condescending. He was attentive. I opened the folder calmly. I didn't tremble. I didn't rush. I began by explaining something simple, that I had never officially transferred any assets. No house, no accounts, no legal liability. I saw her smile freeze slowly, as if the ground had moved under her feet. She tried to react quickly, saying that it didn't make sense, that everything was already on track. It was then that I put the documents on the table, one by one, clear, updated, signed records. The truth needed no dramatization. She supported herself. My son looked at me as if he was seeing someone he didn't recognize. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, I didn't speak like a mother. He spoke like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. That change completely disarmed him. The daughter-in-law tried to invert the narrative. He talked about my age, my health, my supposed confusion. But this time, there were professionals there. People who were not impressed by theatricality. Her every attempt sounded desperate, at odds with the confidence she had displayed for so long. When the attempt to pressure me to sign documents and the threat of putting me in an asylum was mentioned, the environment changed for good. There were no screams, just a heavy silence. That kind of silence that happens when something serious is recognized by everyone. I didn't have to accuse, I just confirmed. He said I refused to sign. I said I felt threatened. He said that I sought guidance. Every word was measured, firm, without excessive emotion. The strength was precisely in this. There was no exaggeration. She stared at me with hatred now. No more contempt. Hate. Because contempt only exists as long as the other seems inferior. When this drops, the feeling changes. And I saw clearly the moment when she realized that she had lost everything. My son tried to speak. He stuttered. He said he didn't know, that it wasn't quite like that. The words ran over each other, empty. For the first time, he had nowhere to hide. The silence he used as a shield now exposed him. When the meeting ended, nothing was resolved emotionally, but everything was legally defined. I had regained something essential, control of the narrative. There was no more room for decisions made without me. I left that place with firm steps, even though my body felt tired. There was no applause. There was no feeling of euphoric victory. There was something better, clarity. The truth had come out in front of everyone, and no one there could pretend they didn't know. At that moment, I understood that this confrontation was not the end of the pain, but that was the end of the lie. And that changed everything. Nothing has gone back to what it was before, and I knew I wouldn't come back. The idea of reconstruction was never about recovering the past, but about accepting that it had ended in a definitive way. The house was quieter, but not empty. The silence now did not diminish me, it protected me. I started to occupy the spaces with another type of presence. I no longer needed to ask permission, nor justify my decisions. He walked through the corridors with the awareness of someone who had resumed his own axis. There was no longer a rush to please, nor fear of displeasing. This in itself was already a victory. My son was still around, but different. Respectful, cautious, almost too distant. There were attempts to get closer, interrupted conversations, incomplete apologies. I listened, but I didn't rush to take it in. Some bridges need to be rebuilt slowly, and others may never exist again as they once did. With his daughter-in-law, there was no reconciliation. There was minimal, polite, cold coexistence. No explosion, no sincere request. Only the clear awareness that the boundaries were now insurmountable. She didn't underestimate me anymore. But respect earned by force never warms up. Just keep your distance. And that was enough. I made decisions I never imagined I would make. I reorganized my life, my finances, my future. I started to plan thinking only about myself. Not out of selfishness, but out of justice. For years, I lived to keep everything together. Now, he understood that unity without dignity is not a virtue. It is a prison. There were difficult days. Days when loneliness tightened, when I wondered if it had all been worth it. But it was enough to remember the plate with remains, the veiled threats, the feeling of being erased, to know that there was no other possible way. The woman who came out of that confrontation was not bitter. She was leaner emotionally, more selective. I learned that love cannot require silence, and that care cannot be accompanied by control. These lessons did not come softly. They came late, but they came complete. I started to be seen in a different way, not as a victim, nor as a frail elderly woman, but as someone who crossed something big and came out on his feet. People started to listen to me more carefully, not because I spoke louder, but because I no longer accepted being ignored. There were moments of deep sadness as I accepted that part of my family only existed as long as I was helpful or silent. That pain has not gone away. She settled down. It became part of my story, not my identity. Today, when I look in the mirror, I don't see the woman who entered that house believing that she needed to adapt to fit. I see someone who understood, late but definitively, that she was never too small. She was just surrounded by people who needed her to be. There was no classic happy ending. There were no collective hugs or eternal promises. There was something better: lucidity, autonomy, the certainty that no one will ever decide for me again under the pretext of love. If I lost something, it was the illusion. If I won something, that's all that matters. Because that humiliated woman at the table, forced to eat leftovers, did not disappear. She has transformed. And the woman who stayed, that one, no one will ever underestimate again. If this story touched on something you recognize in your own life or around you, share this video. It's not just about what I've lived through. It's about patterns of silence, disguised abuse, and people who learn too late to stand up for themselves. By sharing, you can get that message out to someone who can't stand up yet, but needs to know that they're not alone. I'll stay here reading each comment carefully. Tell me, from which city or country are you watching? And what about this story stayed with you? Your words really matter to me.